for CGPS, and his position is kind of like Sam's, another new position for the college within the last year or two. One of the things that we champion here at UNE Online, or that we say is critical to our mission, is being data-driven and metric-driven. And with bringing Paul onto our team just over a year ago, we really put a resource behind that statement, and he's been doing a great job at digging through the robust amounts of data that we have to tell our story through data. So using the CGPS data as kind of the case study, I'm very excited to introduce Paul, who is going to talk about data use in higher education.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to a topic that I like to talk about, which is data. And here at CGPS, we have lots of data to talk about. So let me get started with that. And my agenda today is to talk a little bit about data sources, some of their uses and considerations, and then give you some examples of how we're using data here at CGPS, and then provide some observations about data. So getting right in, why use data? There's a lot of questions that can be answered with data, and I know one of the things that puzzled me when I first started is how many students do we have here taking online courses at UNE? And the answer was, it depends. It not only depends on who you ask, how you ask, and where the data comes from, but there are ways to get at that information. So one of the things we have to look at is not only data sources, but also qualifying what we say about data and how the data might be used to answer questions, such as how many course registrations do we have, and over what time frame, and is that better or worse than last year or last term? Also, where do our students come from? How old are they? What language do they speak? All of these things are information points that we can capture through the application process and enrollment, and also capture from our systems that we use to track courses. Data analysis helps us be informed, allows us to ask business questions, and then have answers to those questions through data. As I mentioned, higher education is extremely data rich. We have a number of great sources that we use daily, primarily our customer relationship management tool, Salesforce, but also Banner, which is our information system for coursework and students. For marketing, we utilize Google Analytics, and we use Pardot. In addition, we have University Online or U Online to track our work as well as our course outcomes. And data is constantly changing over time. As I said about how many students do we have, it depends. Some of the uses we have is marketing. I know I was pleased to see some of the presentations yesterday include some charts and data use for marketing, as well as that journey that a student takes from being an inquiry on our website through being a student that's enrolled and finally a graduate or a successful learner. We have a number of ways to track that information, and we also, as Elena pointed out, use data quite a lot to look at what our growth potential is. What are the factors in the environment that we live within, and how do we better market our products, and how do we maintain a viable support of students through our online programs. Data has its own language, just like everything else. And these are just some of the terms that we utilize, and there's a lot of things we throw around constantly, like what field should we use, what's that variable, what is that data point, and what is a record? I mean, a record could be described many different ways, and it depends on what that record is, like whether it's the student themselves, or their student application, or their course grade, for instance. We utilize a number of databases, as I mentioned, and we provide information that's organized in different tables, And ideally, we'll visualize it so we can take a bunch of numbers and other statistics and pull them together so they're more meaningful and tell a story. Dashboards are another thing I'll be talking about as we move along. One of the things you have to decide with data is what units are you interested in? Like, what is that question you want to answer, such as how many courses were completed successfully last term in whatever program. And to do that, we can pull data out of Salesforce or Banner and compare that information, as well as communicate that information to the stakeholders, the program directors, and our dean. Salesforce objects, you've probably heard that term from Christopher and Carol, and we live with it every day when using our Salesforce tools. And what an object is a database table that stores specific information. And that information is useful depending on how you use it in your queries or reports that you run, as well as how you might summarize that information. Some of the other information we always track by is the contact, which when I first arrived, I thought, oh, that must mean a contact on a telephone or an email, but those are actually activities and tasks. Contacts are our students. So I quickly had to learn that language, and I know that's something we all every day have to face, is how do things change, and what do these terms actually mean? Data definitions are very critical to doing our jobs here. Some of the other data objects include registrations, as in course registrations, cases, as in petitions, and field experience, as in the practicums that some of our programs include. So next I'm going to go into some samples of data analysis, and these are some visualizations that Salesforce, our customer relation management tool, has easily afforded us the ability to present. And these information points provide like a snapshot and a status of where we are at a certain point, depending on how that report was created and run. And in this case, this is a depiction of lead sources over the last 30 days. And as you can see, website and portal are the lead source majority that come in. Roughly 50% of all our leads come in through that mechanism. And then what we can do next is track what happens with an application and where that application came from. Was it from the website or the portal, which is our primary receptacle of getting new students in? And the other thing we can do is also track different stages through the life cycle. In this case, we have applications depicted by, are they complete, accepted, or one of our goals, a deposited application. You'll notice on these slides there's some information here not only on what it is, which is the lead source for applications, but also when it was run. So this is information from October 19th. Looking at analysis a little deeper with applications, and this slide depicts some information that I did a while back, looking at that journey from marketing through the application process and the completion of an application. And in these charts, we have shown the contact to application and then the application completion cycle. So this was to monitor the time it takes from when we have an initial contact through Pardot, our marketing tool, through when we have a completed application, and looking at the different steps along that process and how long those things take. More information on applications was also looked at because there was sort of an allegation out there, probably by myself, that there's so many duplicates in our data we don't really know what's happening. But in actuality, when you drill down and look at that information more specifically and in detail, you find that our students with more than one application percentage is fairly low. And then if you also look at students that come in and apply more than once, which is also sort of like noise or problems in the data, you also have to account for that, but that percentage also appears to be quite low. And you'll notice from fiscal year 16 through 17, and at the time of this study in fiscal year 18, those numbers are actually exhibiting a downward trend. So I'm sure Nicole and her team would be happy to hear that the duplicates are lower than we originally thought. And I know there's also been a lot of work done by our systems folks to avoid duplicates through the work that Carol and Christopher do supporting Salesforce. Now, going back to that question of how many students do we have, well, it depends. And as of October 30th, this is what we had for active students. And this Salesforce diagram shows not only how many we have, 1746 that are actively in a status of taking courses, but it also gives us some view into which program are they in and which degree type are they pursuing. And this is pulled from an object that we use called program enrollments, which is an engaged degree program student who has a record out there that follows their journey and what courses they take, and also ties into the work that student support does, making sure that that student is successful. Looking at active students again, with students we have to assess how much handling do they need. Do they need high touch, or are they somebody who's really motivated and can handle everything themselves? So we've come up with a risk level that's been assigned, and that risk level is shown here by program for active students. Again, kind of showing that there's a distribution between high risk, medium risk, low risk, and no risk. And as we look at that as a data point, we can better manage how often we might need to reach out to that student. One of the things you'll also notice here is there's some missing values with the dash there, and that is another thing I'll talk about a little bit later, but our data is only as good as how we use it and input that information. So a lot of information that if it's missing, we have to kind of consider that and look at that as an opportunity to improve the integrity and the quality of our data. I know we saw some nice charts from Ashley Tellier and her team, Melissa and Josh from the SPHP program. And I was pleased to see her use those charts because she's now a member of our team down here in finance and strategy. But I also looked at some of this information looking at data from Banner, which tracked our course registrations. And this shows a nice upward growth for not only registrations for courses on the left and our student counts. So that is, as we've remarked, a program that's exhibiting good growth at this time, and that's an opportunity for growth for the online college in general, because offering these courses has filled a very viable market niche, looking for folks that are trying to finish those courses that they need to get into other programs. Looking a little deeper at course registrations, this is another chart from Salesforce data that shows the social work program, and it indicates by course. I know it's kind of a busy thing, but I wanted to mainly get across that we have great abilities to depict what our course registrations are. And in this case, this is course registrations by term. And this is for fiscal year 2018 to date. And this is as of October 30th. Another report that I've worked on since coming to UNE is term reports. And this utilizes information from Banner, providing insight into how many courses we had registered each term, how many students were in those courses, and how many withdrew. In this case, we can show there's a small number of withdrawals in the gray, which is the barely visible separator between the two different blues. So we have courses registered, withdrawal counts, and then we have the net courses that were taken for each term. And this is an aggregation of all the CGPS programs, the degree programs, and this shows growth since summer of 15, pretty much through spring of 18. And then our summer term just recently is there as well. And you'll notice a big change with summer 17, and that's when we added some other programs such as health informatics, and we also added more recently a nutrition program. And then on top of that, we also had some changes with how we monitored our social work program. So that big spike in activity is largely based on some of those changes. But that again goes back to the whole point of data. What is it telling us, and what are the reasons it looks like it does? Now, dashboards are on our vehicles, of course, to tell us how fast we're going or how far we've gone, or whether we've left the parking brake on. But in business as well as in higher ed, we can use dashboards to give us some insight into how we're doing. What's our temperature today in terms of how many students do we have that are actively taking courses, and how many leads are we pulling in to get new students? So using Salesforce, we're able to produce a very useful dashboards that will give us insight into our activity. And these are snapshots of activity as of whatever day they're run. And again, I don't expect you to look at this chart and say, wow, what do all those numbers mean? But the idea is that it's a very powerful tool to give us insight into what's going on with our programs at any point in time. So next I'm going to move to some observations about data. And as I said, counts vary by point in time and source of data. And it's important you keep those things in mind in how you structure your query or report that pulls the information, as well as what question you're trying to answer. And the frequency for monitoring, like daily dashboards, will maybe drive you crazy, but looking at it every week or every month or every term give you a better sense on what trends you're experiencing in your data. Also, the other thing I mentioned is missing values. I know that's sort of a bugaboo to anybody who works with data, is like, how do you handle the information you don't have? And a lot of a data analyst's time is spent cleansing the data so that we can have valid conclusions in our analysis. So some of the things we've done here at UNE to help with that is to produce checklists and pick lists so that we only get valid values in certain fields, and also checklists so to make sure that each one of our programs that we're trying to track so diligently actually has the data points in it that we need to, say, complete an application. And then the other thing we're working with is some edits to make sure that you don't find a narrative in a date field, for example. And so some of those edits will help us improve the quality and integrity of our data so we can better analyze what's going on, as well as potentially use that information to predict what happens in future. The next thing that I added here for observations is a status. And we follow a journey that's very complicated, as Sam mentioned, through higher education. It's a very complex system. We have various degrees, we have various courses, and various students that may change over time. And what they are to us at any one point in time is important to monitor. So there's a status that will allow us to identify a certain milestone, whether they're a lead, a prospect, a recruit, or a student, or eventually a graduate. Those are things that are useful to know and how we can do our reporting. We can also monitor that whole journey throughout the lead to prospect to graduating student. Now, duplicates, I mentioned earlier, that's another area that affects data integrity. And I think duplicate detection is one thing that's always a constant, because as you add more data fields and more data points you want, there's also risk there of putting in data that's not valuable. So one of the things that we've noticed, particularly in enrollment, is with our portal for applications, it is fairly easy to put in more than one application or make mistakes such as use several different email addresses, which at the time seemed to be different people, but in fact they're not. One other thing I've talked about a little bit is as you pull data, is what is that data represent? And that is, what is it, when was it pulled, and where did it come from? And all of these things are very important so that you can kind of qualify any conclusions you might draw from looking at that information. So kind of in conclusion, and I think I'm way ahead of schedule, and I'll have plenty of time for questions, is data analysis is useful to inform, answer business questions, identify trends, and support decisions, whether that's a new product or how we did last term or how we were doing this term versus last year. So all these things can be answered with data. And with that, I'll kind of move on to the question phase, and hopefully there are some. Michelle.
Hi, Paul. So one of the things that we talk a lot about downstairs in finance and strategy is data governance, right? And I'm wondering if you can just speak to, maybe for the folks in the room that don't know exactly what data governance is or what it means, can you talk about the role that data governance has played in terms of the state of our data, what we maybe are learning about in terms of higher education and data governance challenges, and some ideas you have to fix that?
Sure. Data governance is kind of a broad topic in some ways, but it's also something that's near and dear to Michelle's and my heart, because we really have sort of a lack of data governance. And what data governance means is that there's a certain responsibility that we as users and the IT environment, as well as any of the other systems that support our information gathering, work together to develop some rules around, like, who has that data, what does that data mean, who owns that information, and when is it okay to change some of that information. And I know in higher education there's the FERPA rules that we all follow in terms of confidentiality for the student, but all those things are kind of components of a data governance, that they get integrated in how data is accessed, how it's used, and most importantly, what are the definitions of certain things. Because as I mentioned, the sources vary and the results will vary depending on the question, but if you have more consistent definitions, you get more consistent results regardless of the system that you pull information from. So does that help, Michelle? All right, good. Other questions? And again, I just wanted to put a shout out to CGPS Finance and Strategy, that if we have anything we can do to help, just like as Sam mentioned with project management, we're here as a resource to assist components of the programs in terms of whether there's something we can help you craft a report or a dashboard, or develop any particular data points that we aren't collecting today that might be useful to you in your management. And also the core importance of using standard systems with governance such as Banner and Salesforce to use as our database to collect all this information in a consistent and quality manner. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Michelle again and go from there.